Welcome to today's webinar, A Doable System for Multiple Dogs. The presentation features a project using hot composting and worms to repurpose dog waste. This online event is hosted by the Enviro Pet Waste Network. Speaker Kathy Duskin is the founder of Rocky Mountain Soil Stewardship, which has been producing high-quality vermicompost since 2009. She was educated at Colorado State University as a soil scientist. Her prior experience includes working at CSU in the Soil and Crop Sciences Department on a team that worked with manure management on large animal feeding operations.
Hi, I'm Kathy Duskin, and today I'm going to talk to you about vermicomposting dog manure on a small farm. Well, I first got acquainted with this group when I heard about Rose's interest in an article in the Denver Post, which is a major newspaper in Denver, Colorado. And I contacted her because I didn't know anybody besides me was interested in composting dog waste, but Rose is. So I reached out and I've learned a whole lot, and now I'm going to share with you my experiences. And this isn't what I think or what I want to do. These are things that I have done. So I'll tell you how they worked and how they didn't. So this book, the Pet Poo Pocket Guide, is totally what connected us. And also you can see that I have 3 good-sized dogs that live on my farm, and I know from my experience as a composter that anything that was once alive can be composted. So I'm not afraid of pet manure. In fact, I'm not afraid of manure in general. I have founded a small business called Rocky Mountain Soil Stewardship, and we produce vermicompost from manure that's generated on our farm from our horses. We own some and we board some, and we use dry leaves that we collect in the fall, and we turn them into vermicompost in a 2-phase process. Now, this 2-phase process is going to come up again, and I'll explain it more as the slides go on. So in the phase 1, we do hot composting for a few weeks, but we're not done. In phase 2, we take that hot compost that's cooled down a little bit, and it's not really compost, but it's ready to be fed to composting worms. And that's what we do. This is not my experimental one, but this is what I kind of do for a living. We have some bins that are located near the barn, and perhaps you can see in the back there's a nice little wooden barn, and in the foreground there's wheelbarrows. Well, these are instrumental because the horses live back here and they poop, and we clean up their manure and we make it into hot compost, and then we put it in these wheelbarrows and we haul it by hand about 100 feet, I'm guessing, to this hoop house. And the hoop house that you're seeing here is rigged up for summer. The sides are rolled up and there's a nice shade cloth over it, and the doors are open. But in the winter, we take the shade cloth off, we shut the doors, we roll the sides down. So the worms happily live in there. And the next slide, this shows the interior of the hoop house. So essentially, it's kind of like 2 raised beds on either side of an aisle. And you notice they're carefully covered with carpets. And underneath these carpets are, I don't know, billions of worms. And they digest the compost that we put on the surface, and we bring our wheelbarrows. These doors are carefully sized for wheelbarrows. So we feed them and they make compost, vermicompost. And then when these bins get full, we have a clever way that we take the worms off the top and we empty it and take it outside somewhere, and then we screen it and sell it. So I'm going to describe this 2-phase system a little, because interestingly enough, it was the first time I learned about this system was at a conference at North Carolina State University that was organized by Rhonda Sherman. And I went to this conference at the invitation of a dairy farmer that I happened to meet. So I learned that when people compost large quantities of agricultural waste that can heat up, that typically they compost it first a little bit, phase 1, and then they feed it to worms, phase 2. So I figured that that's what I would try, and darn it, it works really good. So my commercial compost is made with about a 50-50 mixture of fresh horse manure and dry leaves. I layer it and add moisture and it gets really hot. And then after about a month, it has a nice neutral smell to it and it becomes worm food. And then we have to use these wheelbarrows. And we use a lot of wheelbarrows because our operation is kind of small and, you know, there's not room for tractors and front end loaders and things. So we're a small farm operation. So that's our two-phase system. So now I'm going to turn to what you all are interested in, is pet waste. Well, I've been composting for a long time, and then I learned how to make vermicompost, and I figured anything that was once alive will compost. But I also, having worked in a land-grant university, I knew that the advice from professionals was, we don't compost pet waste. Well, when I worked at CSU, we composted manure from all kinds of animals and dead animals and many things that you probably don't want to know about. So I knew that the diseases were an issue because they're an issue in composting animal manure. People on large feedlot operations constantly worry about diseases, but they do make compost and they know that these diseases that can be transmitted through manure are mostly mitigated in the composting process. So I also have read research articles that show that both composting and vermicomposting have been shown to reduce pathogens that occur in manures of all kinds. Well, so it went against my grain to throw dog manure, and I don't call it dog waste. I call it dog manure because that's what it is. It's not waste. It's a manure just like horse manure, cow manure, whatever. So I learned that I thought, well, I can do this. I can figure out a nice method to compost dog waste on my farm. And I tried a lot of different things, and it wasn't that easy. So I would try something for a year or two and say, nah, that's not going to work. Well, a couple of years ago, I found a way that I thought worked really well. And I'll describe that to you today. And I'll tell you why I think it worked really well. So as a farmer in Colorado, these are my raw building materials: spoiled hay bales and pallets. So I know that when you make compost, you need some kind of an enclosure or a system. So my early systems were enclosures made from hay bales, and they soon deteriorated, and now they're mulch in my garden. And subsequent systems were made out of pallets. And I've decided that I like this system so well that I'm going to build something that's beautiful and more permanent. And so I didn't build anything important to do this in until I thought it was going to work. So here's my success story that I think I have. First, I use a feedstock mixture of dry leaves, a small amount of horse manure, and I think the horse manure adds useful biology to the mix. And then I use a wet mixture of pet manure and food scraps. And I compost them in kind of a 4-bin system that I'll show you. I usually fill the outer bin with the mixture all at once because I accumulate the feedstocks. And then, so when I put it in, make it deep all at once, it heats up very quickly. So after I make it about 4 weeks later, it's cool enough so that I turn it into the inner bin next to it. And I have a little diagram because it's hard to show something over time and space, but I'm going to give it a try. So I turn it into the next bin, and when I'm sure it's cool, because after you've turned it, it can heat up again because you introduce oxygen. So after I turn it and check it so that it's cool, then I go into my hoop house and I take a big 5-gallon bucket of composting worms and I put them in that bin, and lo and behold, they work through that and they turned it into vermicompost. And I was, with the initial time I tried it, I was very pleased with the final appearance. Everything was fine and black textured. There was no sign of any of the original feedstocks. And so I thought, well, I'm going to test this vermicompost along with my other vermicompost. So I sent a sample to the lab, and So this is a 30-gallon trash can. And as you can see, this has pet waste in it. And it's in Colorado, it's always very dry. This stuff has started to mold already. So the decomposition process is starting. But I have the problem of a very dry feedstock. And I know from my experience being a composter that nothing composts very well unless it's moist. So this is a 5-gallon bucket. And in the 5-gallon bucket is slightly decomposed wet food waste. So I got the bright idea that if I mix the wet and the dry together, oh, by the way, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but this is a system that you can get to put on 5-gallon buckets. It's a rim and there's threads inside the rim with a nice screw-in lid. And this is wonderful if you're storing feedstocks or need to get in and out of them and you don't want to have trouble with lids. So I thought I'd stick that slide in so you can see a great idea, because this food waste, it's really, it needs to be kept covered tightly because number one, it smells. Number two, I don't want it to dry out. And number three, pests, rodents are going to get into it. So some of you may recognize this tank as a stock tank. Because I keep horses, I have lots of things like this around my farm. So I found a stock tank that was a little rusty inside that I probably wasn't ever going to use again for water. And this is where I make my mixture. And I put the wet food waste in there and I put the pet manure in there and I kind of let it soak and stir it up. And pretty soon it becomes a slurry. And the reason why I put food waste with it was because I could add less water that way. And I had these food waste because in the wintertime, in Colorado, it's very cold and it's hard to compost food waste because it freezes. So in the spring, I take the wet food waste and mix it with the dog waste. And I have a lovely slurry mixture, which is very wet. And this is a table that shows this is my summary table. It's not the actual lab results, but I'm happy to share them if you like. I sent my 2 samples off to the laboratory, and this is a laboratory that uses a fancy method called Test Methods for the Evaluation of Compost and Composting. It's sanctified by the U.S. Composting Council. So I just sent in both samples. I called one Vermicompost, the other I called it RD. And so here's what I got. I got the pH of both are similar. And can you see that arrow there that one and that one? These pHs are pretty similar. And then the next value here, the EC, that's a level of salinity, and composts that are very high in salt are considered poor quality. Well, it turned out that this column is the one with pet manure, and this column over here is the one with just horse manure and leaves. So this one, the pet manure was a little saltier, about 4, and this one was about 3. So they were both okay. But according to the next test for stability, which is the evolution of CO2, which is a measure of respiration, they were of microorganisms, they were both very stable. But then, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the pet waste was awesome. But this, I'm sure I had let it go a full year. So it was 10, which is about the carbon to nitrogen ratio of organic matter in soil. And the compost that I sell is 12, which is also wonderful. Well, then I had some microbial tests done. I had salmonella done and fecal coliforms. Well, this was the one that I was most interested in because in my pet waste vermicompost, they didn't detect any salmonella. It's not that there wasn't any there, it was below the detection level. So it passed their requirements, as did my regular vermicompost. And then with fecal coliforms, it said it was less than 4.3, and this one was less than, that was their detection level. So they can't detect anything. It has to be above this for them to measure it. So again, I was good there. So I figured that this method was pretty good. And the vermicompost looked good. When I had composted it just with a one-phase thermophilic, I could still see pet waste and leaves and stuff in it. And even though it seemed finished, I didn't like it very much. So I have decided after this experience, I continued doing this method. And I've got a little bit of a variation of it this year because the hay bales disintegrated. The pallets, I had to move them because on a farm, things have to, I need that space for something else. So this year, here's my tank over here in the corner. And I just laid down a windrow of dry leaves and horse manure. And this is quite dry. It's waiting to compost until it gets this slurry mixture applied to it. And then I'll wet it up more. So this is this year's pile. But I have another system that I've designed for a school, and it's very beautiful. It's very robust. It's educational, and it's made out of recycled materials. So we're going to build something like this on our farm as a separate place because I don't want to add anything to the vermicompost that I sell except horse manure and leaves, but I have other stuff. I have chicken waste. I have food waste. I have pet manure. So here's 4 bins right here in the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4. Does this show up, these arrows?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a storage bin for leaves, and over here, this is a storage bin for chopped plants that come out of the garden, and they're useful. But first we make hot compost in the outside one, and when it cools, we turn it into this one. And then meanwhile, we can make hot compost in this bin and turn it into the middle. And there's worms in the 2 middle bins, and they can travel back and forth between these 2 bins. And all the slats come out in the front and the slats come out in the middle. So it's pretty nice. So this is the model that I've chosen. So this 2-phase vermicomposting system is quite a bit different from the one I use for the horse manure because the bins are right next to each other. I don't have to haul anything in wheelbarrows. It's wonderful. So I have 4 little bins together, and then they only have to move this far once, and then they have to move this far. And then when we harvest the finished vermicompost, we kind of rake it out of the middle, and we've developed a way to rake the dry layers. And in Colorado, everything dries out. So we rake the top off, and pretty soon it dries out, and then we rake that off. But meanwhile, the worms move down where it's moist. So we can take these worms and save them and put them to work again. So my personal conclusions are that on my farm, with our weather conditions and the space I have available, that using this 2-phase composting vermicomposting process will create high quality vermicompost. And to me, it's adding sustainability to my business because I feel that when you can return something that was once alive back to the soil, that's a sustainable practice. And I also am pretty sure that this process is adaptable to many different conditions. My climate conditions are harsh, so this would work probably easier in a more moderate climate that was moister. And this process is also scalable. I kind of see this as a pilot project that could be perhaps used on other places. And when I mean scalable, these are big 250-gallon plastic containers. Well, you could use these as mixing vats, and these barriers here are common, and they're used on commercial composting places. They're concrete barriers called Jersey barriers, and you pick them up with a forklift and you put them where you need them. So you can build pretty much anything right away. And this is a picture of a continuous flow worm bin that's good for large quantities, and it's very labor efficient. But this one has some drawbacks because you have to use it in a climate controlled place. And so this might be more adaptable to a municipality or some kind of use like that. And then there's this is the poster child of large scale vermicomposting. It's an outfit in northern New York State. And all these ag buildings are full of those continuous flow bins. And so they make lots and lots of vermicompost, and they happen to make theirs with dairy manure, but there's no reason why pet manure can't be composted on a variety of scales. So that being said, I have one more slide in here somewhere. I thought I did. Okay, I don't see the one slide that I thought I had. And my conclusions are that I could share this with you today, and I might share it with some other facilities that have dogs, boarding facilities, training facilities, rescue facilities, and say, do you want to do a pilot project? However, it's just going to depend on the motivation of those people, because there's not really an economic incentive to doing this. But you have to do something with pet manure. So perhaps it costs them money to do what they do now. My business is about promoting sustainability, and that's not something that I can assume that everyone has that same mindset. So anyway, that's what I wanted to tell you about my on-farm pet manure composting.
Great. And Kathy, we have got some questions in the chat here too.
Okay.
Or a question here, just clarifying. So the phase 1 compost heats up naturally. Like, is that correct? Or maybe even go back to your bin by bin example. I think the question's about confirming that the phase 1, it just heats up on its own.
The natural composting process, if you put in the right amount of carbon and nitrogen, and if you have a porous mixture with oxygen and water, microorganisms start to break things down, just because that's why I like to put the horse manure in there. Leaves have dust. Horse manure has microorganisms. And those microorganisms go to work, and there's a certain community of microorganisms called thermophilic microorganisms, and they're the ones who kind of eat first at the banquet table. And they give off heat, just like we do when we go to the gym and we start jumping around. Well, they're metabolizing, and this is kind of heat from the metabolic process. And then as they give off heat, it's a positive feedback loop for more and more of these to grow. And so it's a microbial process. If you do it right, and if they have all their carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water, it will heat up. And volume, you need to have volume.
Okay, great. And that was a question from Laura. She also followed up with, where can we get the worms? I'm sure you can tell us that. Check out the website.
There are various finder services around the country, and I think Rhonda Sherman on the North Carolina State University Vermicomposting website that she hosts, I think state by state there's sources. You can Google composting worms in my area. You can also purchase vermicomposting worms from big places in California, but at certain times of the year when it's really hot or really cold, they don't always arrive alive. So I would encourage you, and if you think you want to do this, start with a small quantity of worms and let your own population build up, and then take that population and put it to work in pet waste composting. We sell several quarts of composting worms a week, but I sell them locally. I don't have the skills to get them ready to ship. But they're available if you Google local source of composting worms.
Yep. Great. Question from Ben Rodman here. It says, in the batch preparation, how do you get the slurry from the mixing trough to the windrow or bin?
Well, on the scale that we're working right now, we dip it in 5-gallon buckets, and the two things are very close to each other, and the windrow isn't very wide. So I dip it, and I've thought about different kinds of sump pumps and things, but I thought, well, on the scale that I'm working at, I'm going to dip, but I'm going to find some kind of a gravity feed where I I create some kind of a tube with a funnel or a trough. I'm going to use my creativity to get more refined with how I apply the slurry.
Okay. And
Right
Miranda?
now, I just make it happen with 5-gallon buckets. But it's not elegant, but it works. It just needs to be refined.
Okay, great. Miranda had a question too. In the first bin, do you stir the feedstock every so often to make sure that all the feedstock is evenly decomposing?
No, I don't. I'm just very careful when I make that hot compost that it's very fluffy. And when I layer the thing together, I do mix the layers as I go along. So all the types of material are in contact with each other in order to have hot composting happen pretty rapidly. And I like it to be rapid because then you just kind of move this along. If you get all of the surfaces in contact with each other, it happens because bacteria are the first microorganisms that go to work, and they're very small and they live in a water film, so I mix the layers as I go, but I don't mix it again. But I am going to turn it into the next bin, and the worms will work through the whole thing. But I don't put this mixture on top of worms. I make sure after I turn it to the middle bin that I put the composting worms on top and let them work their way in. Otherwise, I would crush and suffocate them.
That's great. Nice comment from Amy Christie in the chat too, saying that it sounds like she's got a perfect spot for replicating it. It dovetailed with a question that I had that I was just curious. So Amy here said, thanks for sharing. We'd love to try a similar setup system at an off-leash dog park that has an adjoining garden run by master recycle composters. So it sounds like that's great. I was curious if you don't have a garden nearby or other waste streams, like if it was a much higher percentage of dog waste, like at a dog park, would that still be okay? Or do you really need the other, the food waste component, the leaves, those other things that you might not have access to just at a dog park,
Well,
99% pet waste?
No, I mean, it might work eventually, but if you want a two-phase process, you have to make the feedstock optimal for microorganisms. And they have to have carbon, they have to have nitrogen, they have to have air, and they have to have moisture. And by definition, composting is the managed process. So the more you manage it, the quicker and more efficiently and better the material will be processed. So I have my doubts that when you just drop bags, even though the bags are decomposable, it helps to have carbon in there and it helps to have it well distributed. And I think in some dog parks, they're not going for a two-phase system. I really like this system where you get it really hot first, and the pathogens have started to break down, and then the worms finish it beautifully. But I'm an experienced enough composter to know what's going to be a good compost mix. And you don't have to have food waste. I could have used water for the whole thing, but I have food waste, and they're mostly liquid, and they have a little bit of nitrogen in them. And dog waste has nitrogen, but not much carbon. And so the leaves make it fluffy and they add carbon. I just kind of know how to, it's like being a chef. You have ingredients and you know how to put them together to make something good.
Yep. And speaking of that, or not a good ingredient, but a question about how compostable pet waste bags, the pickup bags, how it impacts this.
I haven't had direct experience with that, but I suspect that in my system, I might try that in the next batch and just, put a few in there. And what's going to happen is they're going to start to break down in the slurry, and they're going to become very wet. And I think they'll break down just fine when they'll be part of the slurry. They'll be kind of like tissue paper in there.
Okay, great.
But they're going to get stirred around and everything's going to be broken up. And I doubt if I made a slurry out of it, or if it was mixed, say, mechanically in a big tank, I doubt that the bags would be a problem at all.
Oh, interesting. Okay, we've got in the chat. Oh, I was scrolling around here. I think it was Dave. Maybe it said works for a company that makes the compostable bags. Would love to send you some for testing purposes.
I would love to.
That's great.
My address is on our website.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I know I missed one here too. I think there was a question as well about, you mentioned a really slick way to separate the worms from your compost project. Asking if you had more details on that, as well as, go ahead.
Shall I do that one? Well,
sure.
In the front of, let's go back to these really beautiful bins. And I did work to make these bins beautiful because they're at a very public place. These slats in the front come out. And so when I'm ready to harvest, like say this bin of vermicompost, I'm going to take out the slats until I'm slightly below the level. And then I'm going to put a tarp below that. And I'm going to take can you see in this one, there's a cover on the top, it's a carpet. Well, I'm going to take the carpet off and allow the top to dry out. So what's going to happen is the composting worms are going to go, oh, it's getting dry, and they're going to move down. And then I'm going to take a rake and I'm going to rake the dry part off the top onto the tarp. And then I'll take out another board or two and let it dry out, and the worms go down. And so you have to kind of be patient a little bit over time. Maybe it's one day that you're working there. Maybe it's a couple of days if it's at home. This school I visit maybe twice a week. So the worms go down. And when I get to a fairly shallow layer and I can start seeing worm tails, then I take pity on the worms and I take a spading fork and I take that wet material that has all the composting worms in it, and I set it aside until I have a fresh pile to put them to work in. So I can pretty much preserve the worms.
Okay.
There's other ways, but this one seems to be fairly efficient because in Colorado, the surface dries out very rapidly. So I don't have to wait much. And if it was going to be rainy, I probably wouldn't do it. I'd say, well, we'll have to just wait till it's dry and sunny.
Okay. There's another question too that I'm certainly curious about. This one's from Jay Worth. Have you encountered any issues with the city, county, or state regulations when creating the compost?
Well, that's a two-part question. Yep. The compost that I make on my farm from horse manure, in Colorado, the Department of, what is it, Rose? The Department of
Public Health and
Department of Public Health.
CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment, says that farms can compost agricultural materials that they that are produced on their farm, and you can bring on the feedstocks that you need to make that happen. So I don't take manure from other people, and I do bring the leaves on my farm because they make it happen. So in the fall, people throw leaves away. Well, they bring a lot to me and I use them over the year. And with the pet waste, you know, I'm composting something that's generated on my property, and I don't sell this, I don't take it off the property, but I haven't inquired, but I suspect this would come under the auspices of backyard composting at the level I'm doing it at. But I am supposed to let the regulators know that I exist, and I think I have done that. And then that way, if one of your neighbors complains, they'll go look it up and they'll say, oh, they operate under this rule.
Did you answer Karen's question? How long does it take for the worms to break everything down? And I'm thinking it's, you know, in two middle ones.
In Colorado, I'm glad you're reading the questions for me. It's easier not to because my screen has got lots of stuff on it. In Colorado, we have 4 distinct seasons, and it depends. If I can get the worms in there, like right now, in that my current system until I get the other bins built, I'm probably not going to get worms in there until early October. Well, it's going to start to get cold, and they're going to move throughout there. So it's probably going to be like next May or June before I feel that vermicompost is finished. And I won't be putting any more there because by then, you know, on a farm, there's seasons when you can do things. And my season to build that system is probably before the ground freezes. I'm guessing I'll get to it by late October. And so I can start using that system. And this one will be a little more efficient, I think. So, you know, I can't put worms in there much after early October. Things will freeze up in the winter. It's probably about a year's process, but it doesn't matter because once you start doing it, it's a continuous thing. And I always have a place where I can make hot compost and where I can make another hot compost, and it keeps moving through. So maybe the whole, until I get a harvest of vermicompost, it might be a year or less if I can hit the right seasons of the year to get the worms in.
It's like acting with another human being, those worms, you know, you got to see if they're in the mood and all that. Karen had a second question. Once you've put the cool compost in the second bin, do you continue to add new material from the feedstock bins, or do you wait until the compost is completely done before starting the process all over again? So are you throwing more stuff for the worms from the compost, or do you stop?
I move the whole bin at once, and after it's ready, then I introduce worms there, and then I go to the other side where I'm making it again. So it's a two-sided thing. And once the compost gets flipped into the worm bin, I can start making hot compost there again. I try to always have a place where I can get rid of my feedstocks. But once, in this particular two-phase system, once the hot compost is all moved into the worm bin, I don't add anything more. That's phase 2 worms. And they take as long as they take. Now I have to manage that bin pretty carefully because the worms like 50% moisture and they like to be covered. And this system up here that I showed you, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a pallet-like enclosure, but it's not pallets. But you can stuff it with like dry leaves and stuff, and it helps insulate the worms in the winter. It adds, this is the north wall over here, and it adds a little, it keeps things moist and it keeps the worms from, I think, a little warmer. And then in the wintertime, they're going to go down and be close to the bottom. They won't be doing that much, but they'll live.
Did we not answer anyone's question? Oh, can you use a home composter? Joe wants to know.
I don't understand that question.
I think she's just asking, you couldn't put worms in it, could you? If you're using a home composter, you'd just use it for the material. You wouldn't put worms in it particularly, except for that.
You mean a black, like a plastic compost bin?
Yeah.
Yes, I actually have one of those on my property, and I operate it. First, I started to operate it to see how it would work, and it works fine. I don't put pet waste in that. I use that mostly for food waste. But yes, but that system works differently. I add material in a thin layer all the time, and the worms come up, and it's more like the bins in the hoop house, actually, because I make sure that I add small amounts so that I don't suffocate the worms and the material doesn't heat up. And I could talk to her more about that, but we've had really good success. But then in the wintertime, you have to have enough volume in there so that the worms have a place to go where it's not going to freeze solid in our climate. So in a more moderate climate, it's just difficult in the winter. And the ideal way is to have 2 of these side by side. And then when one gets full, you just let it rest, and the worms probably will eventually die, and then you start using the other one until you feel the first one is processed. But yep, you can do that.
Oh, cool.
But it's different. It's not, you know, I do it in thin layers and frequently, like once a week. And it's a variation of this one.
Well, Kathy, does anybody have any more questions? Has everybody answered?
I was curious.
Well,
I had another one, Kathy.
Okay.
Do you feel like this could, talk about pilot projects and stuff too, do you feel like this could scale to the point too, like where you would be looking to take on additional pet manure as a feedstock source? Or do you have all of the pet manure you could handle for this current
Well,
system just with your own
let's go
dog?
back to since you're a Colorado man, right?
Yep.
Let's go back to the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment. If I was to take on pet waste, I would be outside of their definition of agriculture or home composting. So I haven't explored their regulations, and I don't know that I want to do. I might do this as a business. I would consider doing it if I knew like the city wanted to contract with me or something, but I do it at a different site. And probably we would have to go through the permitting process. Although the vermicomposting regulations, I haven't checked on them recently, but it'd be a permitting issue, and I wouldn't try to do it on my farm probably.
Okay. Yeah, just curious about that aspect as well. So, okay, thanks.
Put up your screen, Kathy, that has your contact information in case anyone wants to get in touch with you. Okay, there she is. So, if you need to talk to her about this, we're going to take all the chat questions and we're going to, transcribe them and post them along with the video at the EPWN website. And we'll also send a follow-up email to you with a recording of this in case you want to share it with anyone or take a look back at what was said. So I think we're ready to wrap up. Yeah.
I have a few more comments. One of my slides kind of disappeared, but I do intend to continue testing every year, or maybe more often, but I'm going to add a Helminth test, which tests for parasites. And Rose actually told me that I can get it done at Colorado State University. So I'm going to have a chat with them. But I think the sampling is a little different because this stuff is a little ephemeral. You have to maybe sample it differently or more intensely or over time or something. I don't exactly know how to sample it, but I've sampled it for indicator pathogens, but I'm really curious to also sample it for parasite eggs and things like that.